This is Room Puentedura. Now that we've seen what the research tells us about games and how they embody different aspects of learning in general, let's now look at what the research tells us about what happens when you use games formally in the classroom. Now, before we go into that research, one of the questions we have to answer is, who is it that plays games? And many people have a stereotypical image of the gamer in their mind that's a loner, rather atypical of their classroom peers, doesn't socialize much, mostly male, etc. And that stereotype turns out to be almost 100% completely and totally wrong, because the profile of the game player today is very different from that. The first thing is that the average video game player is not a teenager. The average video game player is 35 years old. So we're not just looking at kids in school right now who are playing video games. We're looking at their parents playing video games as well. Next, it's not just men. 40% of all video game players are women. And additionally, it's not just people who are loners or segregated from the general social environment. 69% of heads of households play video games. So you're not looking at something that's just a marginal pastime in society. You're looking at something that's a mainstream component of societies today. And among teens ages 12 to 17, some additional data fills out this picture. First, 97% of them play video games. 99% of all boys, 94% of all girls. That means, effectively, if you're a teacher in a classroom, pretty much every single one of your students plays video games. It's also not a question of students playing just one type of game, which is another thing that people want to say, well, they like that game. The fact of the matter is that 80% of all of these teenagers that play video games play 5 or more different game types, and 40% play 8 or more different game types. Now, we'll come back to this in a later podcast when we look in greater detail at how different gamer preferences correspond to different game types. But once again, what this means is that you don't have to worry about saying, well, I picked this game, but only a small percentage of the students are going to like it. When you have 80% playing 5 or more different game types, you're looking at an environment where your students are going to accept a great diversity of video games as possible vehicles for what you might want to do in the classroom. The image of the loner is particularly wrong because 76% of these teens who play video games play the games routinely as a social activity. In other words, they don't play by themselves. They either play with others in the same room, 65%, and 27% of them play online. In other words, there's either a social group in the same room with them or a social group online. And I'll mention, by the way, that the ones that aren't listed here as playing games as a social activity may still, in fact, interact with other students around the subject of games as a social activity. In other words, they play the game on their own, but then they see their friends, say, in the cafeteria or what have you, and they'll talk about that game that they played. So once again, games are not an isolating activity, they're a social activity. And in some absolutely fascinating research from the Pew Foundation, and I've got the references as usual, of course, at the end of the podcast, some additional data comes from this work, which is that same room gameplay relates positively to civic outcomes. In other words, those 65% of students who are playing with others in the same room, well, those are the same students that are involved deeply in their community. They're the ones participating in social projects in the community, participating in projects relating to the welfare of their communities. They're the ones that are supporting projects like, say, homeless shelters and so on. In other words, these are not students that say, well, they participate socially in here, but then the rest of their lives is asocial. No, quite the contrary. Social game playing correlates very strongly with good social activity by these teenagers. And in general, game-related social interaction also relates positively to these same civic outcomes. So we see that game playing is not an isolating activity and it's not an atypical activity. It is exactly the type of activity that, frankly, you want your students engaging in, and that in general is found broadly enough, with enough diversity in how it's implemented, that you can safely consider using games in the classroom. Okay, so much now for what game players look like. I want to turn now to the actual educational research. And here there are literally hundreds of papers. It would be insane to try to cover all of them in the scope of one podcast. So instead, what I've done is I've selected 3 papers, and all 3 are of the survey/review type, and they cover different complementary time periods, and additionally they cover different complementary approaches to the question of, well, what do games bring to formal educational environments? What have been the outcomes of using games in formal educational environments? So overall, if you look at these 3 papers, you'll get a very good picture of the general panorama. Additionally, if you go to the references for each paper, you'll get the detailed research paper, that form the basis for them, which you in turn can use to both look at those papers, but also use as a point of departure for a search to say, well, what other research has been done in this arena. So let's look at the first one. The first one is a paper by Randall, Morris, Wetzel, and Whitehill, and this is a meta-study of 68 studies covering the years from 1963 to 1991. So these studies don't just cover computer games, they cover uses of games in education more broadly. And they took the approach of saying, let's look and see how well games work in the classroom based upon what discipline, what subject area they're being used to teach. So they identified games that were being used in the social sciences, mathematics, language arts, logic, physics, and biology. They found in their study that the most effective results were reported in language arts and mathematics, where 12 out of 14 studies showed positive results. And next most effective were the social sciences, where 13 out of 46 showed positive results, and 33 out of 46, in other words, the balance of them, were as effective as traditional methods. In addition to these results, which basically said, okay, you're getting great results from using games in these subject areas, they also found that game learning overall showed better retention than traditional learning. So when you went back and you said, well, okay, how much have they retained from what they learned? Well, the ones that had learned using games did better than the ones that had a more traditional classroom experience. And finally, students showed greater interest in topics taught via games or simulations. So, to summarize, what Randall, Morris, Wetzel, and Whitehill found was that over this time period, they found very positive results in language arts and mathematics, positive results in social sciences, pretty much across the board as effective as traditional methods results. In other words, they weren't showing students getting really bad negative results from using games in the classroom, and with overall better retention and greater interest. Well, that's already a pretty positive point of departure for what the research shows us about what happens in formal use of games in the classroom. The second paper is by Fletcher and Tobias, and it covers the next period of time from 1992 to 2005. And these are 42 papers that are directly related to use of games in instructional settings. And what Fletcher and Tobias did was to say, well, let's look at this from a different perspective. Instead of looking at the research from the perspective of how well did students do in this subject area using games in education, they said, how well did the students do in terms of certain types of tasks, certain types of topics that are involved more broadly in goals in education. And you can see here the list of topics they looked at. There are 7 listed here. In terms of transfer to real-life tasks, in other words, look at a task in a game, does that improve how the students performed in real-life tasks? They found 5 studies that were positive, 1 that was neutral, and 1 that was mixed. In terms of facilitating performance, learning, and transfer, they found 4 positive studies. When you're looking at saying, well, what about transferring to related tasks or domains? So you have a game that, say, is teaching a student a task, for instance, in the arena of urban planning. How well does that student then do in related tasks, in related domains, in related subject areas? They found 8 positive studies. So in 8 of the studies, students were effectively able to transfer not just from one-to-one maps between the game and a real-life task, but between the game and an associated task or domain, and one that was neutral. When you're looking at different variables involved in the educational processes, they found 5 positive studies. When they were looking at effects on overall cognitive processes, think here about the studies on chess, for instance, some of the studies done on puzzle games like Tetris and so on, they found 9 positive results. When they were looking at using games to build up team characteristics, this is very commonly done, for instance, in business schools, to use games to enhance how students will work as a team. They found, interestingly enough, 1 positive and 2 mixed studies. So this is actually one of the weaker results that they found. And when you're looking at saying, well, I want to use a game because it's a little bit of a reward for the students, or it's a little bit more of motivation, it allows them to say, well, take something boring but make it less boring, so just general motivational aspects. Again, the results were not quite as definite as for some of the others. They found 3 positive studies but 2 mixed result studies. So overall, what Fletcher and Tobias found is that for the majority of things that you would want to use games in the classroom for, in terms of these broader topics, these broader themes, they found overall positive evidence to back them up. But at the same time, they found that some of the areas, such as team building, that people tended to assume were, well, just fine, you don't even have to doubt that, you had to take a little bit of a second look and you had to be a little bit more cautious. So they found that there was, in fact, a range of effectiveness for games according to these themes. And we'll come back to this in the next podcast when we look at some approaches to using games in the classroom. Finally, the third of the papers I've chosen is a paper by Merrily Mayo, and this paper covers the most recent years and looks specifically at certain modern-day video games applied specifically to certain subject areas. So, if you will, in some ways we're returning to the earlier paper, but at the same time we're focusing much more definitely, much more narrowly on saying what do games look like today and what do these games that are being used today for these goals in these classrooms have as the result of the outcomes. And you'll see here that she lists 6 games and 6 studies associated with these games and their results. And you find that in algebra, geography, numerical methods, ecology, biology, electrostatics, and cell biology, you have these very positive results in terms of learning outcomes over the lecture. So if you go back to each of these papers, you'll find that these are not small-scale studies. You find, for instance, the smallest one is 86 students. The largest one is about 2,000 students. And they're saying, yes, students are definitely doing better than their counterparts in a regular lecture would by using these games in the classroom. So this is very encouraging. But again, you have to also realize that there is a range of effectiveness for the use of these games. Let's look at that next. I'm going to look at 2 of the games that Merrily Mayo mentioned in her paper. And the first one of these 2 is Dimension Evolver, which is designed to be a game for students to use in studying pre-algebra topics. The game is set up like a first-person shooter. You can see it here in action. You get instructions from the computer, and here it's telling you, well, you have to trip a gate. So to do that, you have to collect a series of prime-numbered shells. Now, the game itself is fun. Kids enjoy it, but notice something interesting here. Think back to all the games that we've seen so far used as exemplars of video games in general. In this particular case, the goals are relatively arbitrary relative to the game. In other words, it's not entirely clear why those shells should be numbered with prime numbers or why you should have to collect them as a way of opening the gate. It's not like, say, in Mario where you say, well, the coins are a natural portion of the world. The objectives here feel a little bit grafted onto the game. So while the kids are having fun, it still isn't a case where you're using the system of the game as effectively as you could. That system, those rules, have a portion that relates to game playing, which is moving about in this first-person shooter type environment, but then there's a whole set of superimposed rules that don't necessarily map on perfectly onto the overall structure of gameplay. So overall, in the case here of Dimension Evolver, when you do the study, you find out that, well, it does have a positive effect on students learning these topics. It doesn't have as positive an effect as games that deeply involve what you're doing for learning in the structure of the game itself, like the next example we're going to be looking at. This next example is River City. River City is a massively multiplayer online game, and it's a game that was created at Harvard for the purposes of teaching students how to think as scientists. In other words, what the topic is of this game is to say, well, you're traveling back in time to the 19th century, people are falling sick, well, you have to use your skills to figure out what's causing them to get sick, and you have to juggle here some social factors, some environmental factors, and you're placed in this environment as an actual active player, collecting data, talking with characters, etc. So River City, unlike Dimension Evolver, involves very deeply the structure of the goals of the game in the fabric of what students should be learning. In other words, the goals of the game, what they have to do, is not accidental. They're playing through this role-playing scenario as scientists trying to save a community where people are falling ill. Not surprisingly, River City shows much larger, much more effective results in terms of how students' educational outcomes are improved by the game. In terms of the SAMR model, which I've developed for evaluating the use of technology in the classroom, the Dimension Evolver game program is at the substitution augmentation levels, because what it's doing essentially is saying, well, let's take a traditional worksheet, and in traditional worksheet you'd say, tell me all the prime numbers from this list, which ones are primes, which ones are not, and putting it in the context of a video game. That makes the overall task fun. It makes it less boring than just filling out endless numbers of worksheets, but at the same time it's not significantly different from the worksheet. There are no additional visualizations within the game in this portion, for instance, to tell students what a prime number is, other ways of thinking about prime numbers, etc. There are some visualizations later on, but they tend to be only weakly connected to gameplay. So overall, you're at the substitution augmentation level. You're still using the game as a substitution or a slightly augmented version of a traditional worksheet. Meanwhile, River City is at the modification redefinition levels, because the type of tasks that you have students perform here go well beyond the traditional, okay, do a science lab. You're completely redesigning what's involved in a lab. You're putting a whole social context, a whole spectrum of additional considerations on scientific research that are not typically available in the traditional lab experiment, and you're creating new tasks for them to tackle as teams, to tackle in the context of saying, well, how would you look at the problem from this very broad integrative perspective that would pretty much have been very difficult to accomplish before. So here you're looking at something that's at the modification redefinition, in other words, the transformation level. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the SAMR model, you'll find a reference to another series of podcasts at the end of this podcast. So we've seen the profile of what a game player looks like and seen that it is in fact favorable to our goals. We've also looked at the educational research and seen that in fact it supports very well what we would like to do with games in the classroom, although it also says that we have to be a little bit careful about the specific set of goals we would like to achieve. And finally, we've looked at two examples of recent video games and their use in the classroom and seen why one seems to be more effective than the other. As always, here are the bibliographic resources for the material I mentioned in this podcast. And finally, in closing, I would like to suggest that you go to the websites for the two games I used as example. Dimension Evolver, and River City, and use them as the basis for a small exercise. For Dimension Evolver, I would recommend that you download the demo of the game that's available for free from the website and play it yourself at least for a little while, and then analyze it in terms of everything we've discussed in previous podcasts about games, what makes good games, what makes bad games, games and learning, and then use that to further your understanding of why this particular educational video game is successful but only up to a certain level. And then I would recommend that you go to the River City website and take a look at the materials that have been placed there by the developers of the game. Unfortunately, the game itself is not currently available for players to join, but you will nonetheless, I think, get a good idea of what the game looks like, and once again, try to analyze it in terms of everything we've seen thus far. So next time, we'll be talking about one particular approach to using games in the classroom, which is called critical gaming. Until then, enjoy playing some games, and I'll see you then.